Appreciate you tuning in here to Birds 365. McMullen and McDonald hanging with you. Big day on the NFL calendar, schedule release day. We already know the week one matchups. We'll get the rest of them later in the day. We surely want to continue to talk about that. But also, big time in getting the season ready for the Eagles. The NFL draft just taking place. Free agency still ongoing, but certainly slowed down. We want to get a pros insight as to how the Eagles are going about getting their roster ready for the upcoming season. Guy who's done it for years in the National Football League, is an executive, former general manager of the Dolphins and the Saints. Randy Mueller joins us here on Birds 365. Randy, thanks for hopping aboard.
Hey, guys, good to be with you.
Yeah, and Randy, for those who don't know, former executive of the year, so he's done it at a very high level. His brother Rick, by the way, also was a personnel executive with the Eagles for about 5 years. I'm guessing 5 or 6 years. So, Randy, first question I want to ask you, as a former GM in this league, especially in this year, where it was obviously the pandemic affected the salary cap, goes down for the first time in history. If I were an owner and said, okay, we got to move on from a quarterback, and that's going to be 16, almost 16.5% of your salary cap that's already scaled back. How historic would that be? 16.5%.
That would be crazy. That's for sure. The band is playing Who to Thunk It, right? I mean, it's one of those things where there's no chapter in the GM book for this part of the on-the-job training. That's for sure. So teams have been challenged. They've been strapped. It's, the one thing about it is, I'd say this, they knew it was coming. So a team like the Saints, for example, that had to trim almost $100 million, they knew it was coming last summer. So they had a plan, and they were able to execute it pretty good. So I think they're, kind of the poster child for making this work. We'll see this fall what kind of job they've done. I think they've got a frontline team. I think where you'll see it is the erosion of depth around the league. That's been hard because there's been a lot of backups, a lot of guys that weren't vital that were put on the street because of the cap.
Let me ask you about it. I don't want to go specifically Saints, make it a generality question, but if you use the Saints as an example, that's fine. When you're faced with something like that, when you're expecting the cap to be higher and something like a pandemic comes in, you can treat it one of two ways. Either you can say, we're going to rip the Band-Aid off, we're going to eat all these bad contracts, we're going to take dead cap money hits, and we'll be better for it next year. Or you can do the renegotiation thing and try and spread it out over a period of time. How do you make that decision? Which way you're going to go? Are you capable of doing a little bit of each? Is there a little from column A and a little from column B?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think somewhere in the truth always lies in the middle for me. I think you've got to redo some deals. You've got to take care of some players at the same time. You're trying to keep your best players, right? That's your goal. You always want to keep your best players when you're team building. I always find it difficult when a new regime comes in and can't wait to run off players and get their own guys. Well, it's easier said than done than replacing those guys. That's for sure. So I think it's people have used different models around the league. I mean, as you guys know, Howie uses his model. Bill Belichick's model this year was totally different in that he had saved some cap space. I don't know if that was on purpose or not, but he was able to use that in a big, deep talent pool that's never been there before and sign a ton of free agents. I mean, he signed and spent the money, and we all saw it in February. We never would have thought we'd see Bill enter into this free agency like he did. But I think it was for good. It was for a good reason, and it was good timing on his part. So we'll see the fruits of everybody's labor come this fall. I think some teams, you're right, did take the time to bite the bullet, right, and get rid of some bad contracts and just try to make a case that, hey, we're going to have a hiccup this year. We'll see. I just think everybody's philosophy has been different, and it'll be fascinating to see how it plays out when we get to the fall.
When you talk about templates, Randy, for building rosters, obviously there's not one way to do everything, but I do think everyone would agree it's pretty obvious. The goal for just about every team in this league is to get the quarterback. And it seems recently teams are willing to give up a little bit more quickly on high-profile quarterbacks. New York Jets, Jody's a big Jets guy. They're drafting a quarterback in the top 5. Couple years later, They're drafting another quarterback in the top 5. Do you see a big shift in the league over the past few years saying, okay, we're willing to turn over at the game's most important position a little bit more quickly? And is that a good thing?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a valid point. I do think teams are more willing to swing and miss. They want the bat off their shoulder. They're going to go down swinging. And we saw that with the Rams giving up on their guy. We saw it a little bit in Philly, with Wentz passing the torch, and moving over to Indy. So I think, yes. And I would have said going into this, there's no way teams will eat $30 million in cap to get rid of a quarterback. That sounds ludicrous to me. Well, be careful what you wish for, because it actually happened. I think it's a tough position to be in, because eventually these quarterbacks that we all want are going to be making $35-40 million a year. Like you said, there's been no team to make the Super Bowl or win a Super Bowl with that kind of cap commitment to a quarterback. So I think the poster child for that this year might be Baker Mayfield, right? We all think the Browns are better. He had a good year last year. He's due for a raise here at some point. Is he going to go from where he's at up to that 40-45 million now and really hinder the rest of your team building around him? I think that's a philosophical discussion that everybody's having now in NFL offices. Is the quarterback salary too much at some point?
Randy, let me give you a hypothetical here because it happened in reality, but I'm going to make you the general manager of another team in the league. It becomes obvious Carson Wentz becomes available. The asking price is what it is. It's going to be about what the Colts ended up playing, but you have to make a commitment that Carson Wentz is your quarterback. If you were the GM of a team that didn't have a given at the quarterback position, would you have taken a shot on Carson Wentz? Would you have paid the price in draft capital that it took to get Carson Wentz? Do you think he gets it turned around with another team after a historically bad season last year?
Yeah, I think I definitely would have taken that plunge. I thought you were going to go back to what you thought about Carson Wentz coming out of school for the most part. But then you've got to also analyze and get beneath the surface of what happened in Philadelphia. So I don't particularly in this case blame all of it on Carson Wentz. Sure, he didn't have a good year, but I think most would agree it was a season of injury for them. It was a season of let's just face it, a subpar roster, and it just didn't come together, whether some of that was coaching, whether some of that was developing the talent, or just piecing it all together. Having a team on paper is one thing, but having it really develop on film and as we go through an NFL season, that's a whole nother thing. So I would have taken the plunge. I think Carson Wentz is going to be fine. I was not ready to give up ship for him. And I think in the Colts case, they're a team that's kind of built for the playoffs already. It's not like they're in a rebuild. It made sense to them as well. Carson Wentz would have made sense to me in San Francisco, would have made sense to me maybe even in LA with the Rams. So there were other places as well that would have made sense for me. That's just the way I feel about Carson Wentz. I'm not ready to set sail with him as being a flop, so to speak. I think he's got some good years left in him.
We're talking with Randy Mueller, former NFL Executive of the Year. You can check out his website, MuellerFootball.com. Randy, I wanted to talk to you. You mentioned about a roster. It might look better on paper. I look at the Philadelphia Eagles where we are and Howie Roseman winning Super Bowl 52. One of the most difficult things I would think as a GM is to sort of walk that tightrope. And the old adage is better to give up on a player a year early than a year late. When you're in that championship window, how difficult is it to see when the window shuts and you got to kind of turn this thing over?
I think that's the hardest thing, is knowing when to turn the page and knowing that the same guys that helped you win a Super Bowl may help you lose one in future years. So you've got to be willing to pull the trigger. I think it's hard because you feel a sense of loyalty to your own roster. You feel that you owe these guys because of what they brought to you, your franchise, your city. And that's a hard thing. And I think really the Eagles fell a little victim to that. They kind of overvalued some of their own players that got them there. And it's understandable. That's a fine line, like you mentioned. So, I think you've got to find a way to always be on the edge of looking to improve, whether you're winning or not, and you can't be satisfied where you are. Look at a guy like Nick Saban, what he's done in Alabama. Just every third year, you think it's a reload. Well, he's willing to pull the trigger and and find ways to change things up within his own program. It might be building a new facility. It might be putting a fresh coat of paint on something, outside, just so that the guys feel different every year. And I always thought that's a challenge in the NFL, to make guys feel different. We had a great year in New Orleans one year where we won the first playoff game in the history of the team. The minute we were done, I was looking to find a way to change things up, even if it was cosmetically, a new locker room, a new this or a new that, just so the mindset is different when those guys come back the next year, so that you can get them hungry again and not worried about or thinking about the past. You want them to look forward to the challenge, and there needs to be a newness, so to speak. That's hard in the NFL.
Randy, I need your talent evaluation skills here. If I told you your team was able to add a Heisman Trophy winner at the wide receiver position, hasn't been done in 20 some odd years. Yeah, but he's 166 pounds. You got a wide receiver who caught 23 touchdowns this past year and over 2,000 yards. Yeah, but he's 166 pounds. Are you a but guy?
I am not in this case. Sometimes I think you have to be a realist, but in this case, I never thought Devonta Smith had fatal flaws because of his weight. I think the guy's a good player. I've said from halfway through last season, this is the best receiver in the draft. I even went down on that hill at the end, even though the LSU kid got picked ahead of him. I like Devonta Smith. I think he's proven that he can play at whatever weight he has in the SEC week in and week out. And not only that, every day in practice at Alabama. You don't think those corners give him everything he can ask for every day on the practice field? So he's used to his weight. He's used to people challenging him. He's used to people questioning him. I don't think that's a problem at all. And I think he's going to be the Eagles' best receiver. I think it comes down to, again, what the organization can put around him to give him a chance. I don't think this guy's the savior, that's for sure. But I do think he'll be a productive, really good NFL player.
All right, Randy, I'm going to play devil's advocate because that's what I do on this show. Maybe it's too negative, but I'm going to talk about positional value because I look at Calvin Johnson. I mean, that's one of the greatest receivers of all time. Number 2 overall pick. You're not going to do better than Calvin Johnson. Ultimately, though, what did it do for the Detroit Lions? I mean, a receiver can only do so much.
Right.
So when you're talking about a positional value in the top 10 of the draft, obviously quarterback, what were your other philosophies? Offensive tackle, edge rusher. Can wide receiver have the same impact on the game as those types of players?
Yeah, I think you're right. And you're asking a guy who picked Ted Ginn 9th when I was at Miami. So the way it worked out then is very similar to the way it worked out this year. You can't control the quality of the players around you. So I would always err on a tackle or a big defensive lineman if I could, because I think big guys make the difference in this day and age. I still think you have to be able to run the ball. I still think you got to be able to stop the run in different ways. I'm not sold on the edge rusher. I think you make a lot of mistakes when you pick edge rushers because technically we don't even have that position in our starting 11, right? So that guy's got to play the run. I'm going to err on the side of I want a bigger, stronger defensive end over an edge rusher anytime, and I want to tackle if I can get it as well. And like you said, set us quarterbacks aside because I think that's a totally different thing. But you can't control, and this was a great draft for that, you can't control the depth of the draft. You can't control the quality of the premier players in the top 10, so to speak. So sometimes you just got to pick the best player that comes your way. And if it happens to be at a position of need, so be it. So I think that's the dilemma that maybe Howie or the Eagles were faced with this year. Maybe they would have loved to have had a tackle or loved to have had some defensive lineman that they could bank on for the next 10 years. Those guys weren't there. So they had to make the best of what they had.
Randy, as a former general manager, I need you to explain to our listening audience, and if you can give it some context, please do so, the relationship between a general manager and a head coach. It might be the most important relationship in an entire National Football League organization, even more so than the owner with either the general manager or the coach. They have to be on the same page. They have to be working with the same purpose. If they don't, then things start to come apart, kind of like it did with the Eagles this past year when it seemed like Doug and Howie and Jeff and Doug got off the same page. How important is that relationship? How do you know when it is working and is where it needs to be for your team to be successful in moving forward?
Well, I think it's a great point, and I think it's the most important relationship. It is all about communication in my mind, but it has to start with a mutual respect. They have to respect each other. They have to understand what each other's job is to do that. I always said this, and I'll be honest, I learned this from Bill Parcells years ago. When he had Dick Haley as his personnel guy, he said, I can go into Dick's office anytime and say whatever I want, and vice versa. And when I leave or he leaves, the door shuts, we're good, and we move on. Sometimes you just need someone to vent to. Sometimes you need a respect factor that you really, two heads are better than one, right? I don't think I ever worked with a coach where I decided at the end of the day that we're going to do something where the coach wasn't on board. That relationship doesn't work ever. And I think if you respect the coach and understand his job, you'll never come to that, fruition at the end of the day. So I do think it's an important role, but again, I think it's a respect thing, just like it is with your top players. I think the respect you get from your top players in that locker room and vice versa filters down through the whole organization. And I think that's maybe what we're seeing in Green Bay right now is not the respect factor that I think should be there. But you hit it on the head. I think the head coach and the GM working together is the only way this thing can happen, especially with all the amount of changes you have to make to your roster year in and year out nowadays, the way the cap is and the way the NFL team building model is set up.
All right, you went down that road, so I'm going to go further down it, Randy, with Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers, because that's a superstar player. I mean, that is the superstar player. That's the MVP of this league. That's the best quarterback in football. As a GM, and obviously Brian has taken some hits from Aaron's camp and at least some whispers. How difficult is it to deal with a superstar player like that? You have to keep him happy at all costs?
I think you definitely, again, I go back to the communication factor. I just think it's a thing that, let's just face it, communicating's hard, whether it's in our own home, whether it's with our kids, whether it's with relationships, it's all the same, right? Communicating is hard. And I just think in that case, they underestimated the power of communication with Aaron. And I think not to fault Brian totally on it, because we all know Aaron's difficult, right? I mean, we'd have to admit that. But I do think that going in, you have to cultivate that relationship all the time. I think, again, there's got to be give and take and trust involved. And I think that's all been broken in this case. I don't know how they fix it, but it's a hard one. You see it happen in a little bit in the offseason in Seattle with Russell Wilson this past offseason. And now they seem to have patched it up a little bit. So, who knows how that's going to work out, but it's a trust factor that as a GM, I used to kind of stay out of the locker room, right? I never wanted to invade the player's space. But having said that, I was at every practice. I loved to visit with those guys on the sidelines, and it didn't have to really be even a verbal communication. It was nonverbal. It was body language. Gave you a chance to really know the pulse of your team. Players know players. Players also know if what you're doing is right or wrong. They get it. They've been through this before. So I think you can learn a lot from communicating with your players. I just don't know if that's happened in Green Bay quite enough. And I think that's probably why we're where we're at.
All right, we'll take you to a walk down memory lane. Communication being as key as it is. Communication between the general manager and the coach. Certainly the communication between coach and player is huge. But general manager play not as much, but it is having a major influence in Green Bay right now. Who is the individual? Could be a coach, could be an owner, could be a player that you had to work the hardest you ever worked to make sure communication stayed on point, that it was just heavy lifting with that individual to do what you needed to do to have the open lines of communication?
Well, I would say this, and I spent a couple years with Nick Saban in Miami, right? And we all know what kind of a person he is and how he runs his ship. Disciplined, detailed, everything about it. But if you understood the goal at the end of each day, you understood he only cared about us getting better. I think that was a hard one for me, mainly because I had spent 25 years in the NFL, so I had a pretty good base. And Nick came in with the idea of exactly how he wanted things. So it took us a while to meld our thoughts. It took us a while to meld our communication. Some of it was just technical, right? Nick was a little bit older than me. He wasn't a texter. He wasn't an email guy. So I spent a lot of time waiting outside his office to meet with him face to face, if you will. That bogged a lot of my time down. And his wife used to always say, "What can I do to help? What can I do to help?" I said, "Well, you can teach him how to email or teach him how to text." That would have helped me a lot. But it is what it is, and I chuckle now when I read and hear about Nick being able to text. So that bogged us down a little bit, but nevertheless, there's nothing like face-to-face communication. That's what he was comfortable with, and it worked good for us in Miami during our 2 years together.
All right, Randy, let's talk about communication in the war room, because I'm sure you saw the kerfuffle between Howie and Tom Donahoe, which I think was overblown.
Yeah,
but it happens all the time. Rick was in, the Eagles war room with Howie. Am I wrong? Is that overblown? Does that kind of disagreement happen? Or is it just as simple as somebody's got to know the camera's in the room and hold off before you start arguing?
Yeah, I think it's a style. I think it's maybe Howie's style. I have never been one to celebrate a draft pick anyway. Yeah. I have never been one to give out kudos in a draft room. Here's the other side of that. You've got a bunch of players out there watching every move you make as well. Do you think Aaron Rodgers still has in his mind, in that vision of Brian Gutekunst and the coach celebrating when they traded up to acquire Jordan Love? I'll bet he does. He saw them pump their fists, and I'm thinking he thinks, wow, they're celebrating getting the guy who's never played a down of football ever. He has no sweat equity with our team. So I always see it. There's a different side of all of these reactions, right? It's an equal kind of toxic reaction on the other end. So I'm not much for circling the room, high-fiving people and calling attention to ourselves. I always felt like as soon as we made a pick, we're on the clock for the next one. So let's get to work. You're going to have those things. If you're willing to put yourself out there, everybody knows there's cameras now, right? If they say they don't, that's baloney. Everybody knows there's going to be a camera. They go through all of this information and all of these camera setups and public access. The decision makers know exactly where all this stuff is. So you take that risk. And I get it from Tom's standpoint. I was in a lot of draft rooms where I wasn't thrilled with the pick either. And I tried to limit discussion on draft day for that reason. If we don't have this out and have all of our discussion, the hay in the barn, so to speak, a few days before, don't bring it up to me on draft day. Let's don't get pissy on draft day, because we're on this together. And I just think that's a discussion for another day. It sometimes manifests itself on draft day because emotions get involved, but that's the risk you take. I just think you've got to be more aware, if you're Howie, of all that stuff, and that you have to understand everybody might not be 100% on board with every decision you make. That's just life.
Randy loved the phrase sweat equity. One of my favorite phrases when it comes to football. Let me take you to today. As a former general manager, it's schedule release day. You're waiting like everybody else. Maybe you get a little inside information. You get a game or two at a time, but you don't have the schedule till everybody else is going to get the schedule.
Right.
What's the first thing you're looking at? Is there a specific thing that you're going to learn when you get the schedule that you say, all right, I got to know this because I got to react to this. I got to see if we're good to deal with this. What's the first thing you look at when you get your team schedule?
I think as a GM, you're just like the fans. I'll be honest with you. I don't know what you're going to do to control it. I find it's interesting, and I always couldn't wait to get it. I was probably looking for three things. One, how we start the season, the first 2 or 3 games, where we're at. How we end the season, if we can end at home with 3 of our last 4. And then how many Monday night games or national TVs games are scheduled where it's going to alter our schedule. A Sunday night game or a Monday night game or a Thursday game, or in some cases a Saturday game back in the day. So I always looked for the schedule altering games so we could plan it. Maybe there was, for us, all my years in Seattle, we always had kind of hoped for 2 games in a row on the East Coast. So maybe we'd stay back there the whole time. So things that might affect your travel schedule and things like that. But for the most part, hey, like Yogi says, we can only beat the teams on our schedule when we play them, right? We got 16 games. Now we got 17 games. So we'll see how it works out. I'm anxious to see it just like everybody else, but I don't know that there's a defining thing that you find in that schedule that's going to send you back to the drawing board as to how you're going to build your team or how you're going to put your team on the field in August.
Randy, last one from me, and thanks for joining us. Former League Executive of the Year. Check him out at MuellerFootball.com. I do want to talk to you. You were in Seattle for a number of years as well. That is one of the most difficult places to play in the NFL. So loud. Last season, that didn't come into play. I think there were a lot of teams like Seattle, New Orleans, Minnesota, Philadelphia here where we are, that were really affected by empty stadiums.
Yep.
Fans are going to be back to business. How much of a difference does that make for a team to have, especially a team like Seattle, like Philadelphia, that has such a significant home field advantage?
Well, I think it's definitely reflective of your defenses, that's for sure, because I think there's no harder place to get off the ball than like you said, at Quest Field in Seattle, where noise is an issue. Same in Philadelphia, same in New Orleans. Some of these places where defenses have made a living on sacking quarterbacks and making things hectic for offenses. I think this proved it out that more road teams won last year than ever before. So it's just the way it equaled out the home and homes, right? And now I think you're going to go back to seeing some advantages for home games. We pretty much had to write that off last year. Yeah, that was still an inconvenience for travel, but having to not have to put up with the noise of a visit or a home team, if you're the visitors, that's a game changer. And you saw completion percentages higher than ever. You saw sacks lower. You saw a lot of numbers that back that up. So I think for the good of the game, obviously it's fun to have the fans involved. I think you can plan a little better. I think you build your team a little differently. If this were to extend over a long period of time where there's no fans, I think the impotence of the way an edge rusher can affect the game is dissipated, right? Because the get off is a big thing. And that tackle can't get out of his stance quite as fast if he can't hear anything around him, can't even hear himself think. So I think that'll be the fun part about it. I think preseason coming back, obviously we know there'll probably be 3, maybe less preseason games, but when GMs are building their team, preseason games mean a lot. And so that factor wasn't there last year. Teams were built really on paper. You didn't get a chance to see anybody play football, right? And so I think for the good of the game, when you put your teams together, I'd obviously rather see them playing football than just in shorts and helmets in practice. So a lot of different variables. I think we'll all be happy to get back to normal. That's for sure.
Randy, I appreciated the answer that you gave my question about what's the first thing you look for when you get the schedule. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you a follow-up, and I'm going to ask you to be 100% honest with us. Not that you haven't been. I think you've been very honest in all your answers, but I need this one to be truly honest. When is the first time you get your hands on the schedule? Do you get out a pen and go W, L, L, W, W, W that day, the next day, or Jody, I never did it once in my entire career?
Well, I'm not going to say I never did it once in my entire career, but it really was not a factor for me. Here's the problem, Jody. In every NFL season, right, we don't get to play East Carolina. We don't get to play Georgia Southern. We're grinding every week. So any of these teams, if you're not doing your job, they're going to come whack you upside the head. So I never really played that game of we should win this, we should win that. I think sometimes those games are even tougher to execute because you've got to have motivation. And again, it so much depends on the health of your team from week to week and the matchups. So I kind of cringe at people that can go through there and think they can pick based on a schedule how a team's going to end up, because it's a whole nother ball game. You get your left tackle hurt in week 2, your season changes and you got to figure out a way to adapt. So that's where a general manager's eyes and head go. It's how to manage your team once the season starts.
Randy, feel free to be tuned in tomorrow and cringe with us, because McMullen and I are going to go right down the list. Win, loss. Our jobs don't depend on it. It's just fun for us. We will cringe tomorrow.
I understand, and I don't blame you a bit. Those are fun things to talk about with fans, for sure.
We will do that tomorrow. Randy, it was great having you with us here today. Thank you very much. We will tap into you for your expertise again down the road. Thanks for joining us here today.
Anytime, guys. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy.
Randy Mueller, ex-executive of the year in the National Football League, Saints general manager, Dolphins general manager, here with the Mac and Mac guys on Birds 365. All right, let's get our final timeout. Come back, put a bow on the show. Keep it tuned to Birds 365.
If you missed any of today's show on the JAKIB Media channel, listen to the podcast on your way home. Available on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.